But then what they did then, the next following League Cup final, they ran a competition to see if anybody could get a better banner. So 2 years on the trot, this nickname of mine was stuck on a television. And I met the guys that had done it, and they were from this leisure centre in Horsford. But it just stuck with me. It was just there, and wherever I go, people just say, if they say Norman Hunter, oh, bite your legs. So it's just...
You're gutless. That is what they called Norman Hunter from the terraces, from the back pages, from living rooms all across England. And here is the thing. He was not gutless. He was one of the most feared defenders this country ever produced. A man who gave 15 years and 726 appearances to Leeds United. A man tied to a World Cup winning squad, to the most successful period in Elland Road's history, and to a nickname that followed him until the day he died. But underneath all of that, there was a story that nobody knew, a battle being fought in private. And when his daughter Claire finally broke her silence, it changed the entire ending. I'm Brandon, and this is Beyond Football. If you have got the hype feature on this video, tap it right now, because this story deserves to be heard by every Leeds fan alive. This is not just a story about a tough footballer. It is a story about what happens when the Hardman image becomes a cage, when the public decide who you are, and no matter what you do, they refuse to let you out of it. Norman Hunter spent decades being boxed in by 3 words: bite your legs. That was his box: dirty, brutal, a problem to manage rather than a player to admire. And yes, there were moments that fed that story. There was the Poland mistake that stopped England going to a World Cup. There was the Franny Lee brawl that played out on national television for the country to watch in horror. There was The Damned United, a film that practically cast him as the villain of his own era. I personally think the damage done to his reputation by that film is one of the great injustices in how this sport remembers its people, and I will explain exactly why. But what makes this story bigger than football controversy is what his daughter revealed after his death. Claire Hunter eventually broke her silence about something the family had protected for years. Her father had been fighting chronic lymphocytic leukemia for 7 years before he died. 7 years of a weakened immune system. 7 years of a secret the public never knew. And when COVID arrived in April 2020, that secret became the final chapter of a life that deserved a better telling. So we start where the story ends, because that is where you feel it the hardest. April the 10th, 2020. The country was in its first national lockdown. Streets were empty. People were scared. And then the news broke that Norman Hunter had been admitted to hospital after testing positive for COVID-19. For anyone who knew his reputation, it felt wrong. This was not the kind of man you pictured lying in a hospital bed. This was the man who had broken up attacks, put his body on the line for 15 years, and spent 3 decades as the voice of Leeds United on the radio. Hard men do not go down like this. That is what people told themselves. They were wrong. The footballing world paid attention immediately. Between the 13th and 15th of April, messages of support came in from players like Liam Cooper and Luke Ayling, the Leeds squad, the supporters, former players from rival clubs. All of them held their breath. The hope was real. People had seen Norman Hunter take bigger knocks than this and get back up. Then, on the 16th of April, the reports changed. Medical staff described him as severely unwell. That phrase landed hard. Not stable, not improving, severely unwell. For a man whose entire public identity was built on physical toughness, the language felt brutal, and the timing made everything worse. Families could not visit because of lockdown restrictions. Hospitals were under pressure that the National Health Service had never faced before. The world was quieter than it had been in living memory, and Norman Hunter was somewhere in the middle of all of it, fighting something he could not tackle his way out of. On the 17th of April 2020, Leeds United confirmed his death. He was 76 years old. The tributes were immediate and overwhelming. Former teammate Eddie Gray described him as a truly great football player who was right up there with the best to ever walk through the gates of Elland Road. Players, managers, pundits and supporters from all over the world stopped to mark the moment. But the public image of Norman Hunter was the Hardman, the bruising centre-back, the man who bit your legs. And there is something uncomfortable about that image meeting an ending like this. The mythology of the Hardman suggests invincibility. It suggests that someone that tough, that physical, that relentless should be untouchable. That is how we built him up. And the mythology made the reality land even harder when it came. He was not invincible. He was 76. He had been quietly fighting a blood cancer for 7 years. And a global pandemic found the gap in the armour that no opposition striker ever could. We celebrated him as indestructible for decades, and then we were shocked when he turned out to be human. That shock is on us, not on him. The groundwork for this ending had been laid years earlier, in a doctor's office, in a conversation that his family chose not to share with the world. Not yet. His daughter would change that, and what she revealed changed the entire story. Claire Hunter did not have to say anything. She could have kept the private life private. She could have let the football world grieve and move on with the Hardman story intact. But she chose to speak. And when she did, she reframed everything people thought they understood about her father's final years. 7 years before his death, Norman Hunter had been diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. CLL is a rare form of cancer that affects the blood and bone marrow. It develops slowly in most cases. People can live with it for years and may show no visible symptoms in the early stages. But what it does, quietly and relentlessly, is compromise the immune system. It weakens the body's ability to fight off infection. It makes the person carrying it vulnerable in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Think about what that means in the context of his final years. This was a man who continued working right up until his hospitalization. He was still turning up at Elland Road as a match summariser, still talking football on BBC Radio Leeds and Yorkshire Radio. From the outside, everything looked normal. He was still Norman Hunter, but inside, his body had been quietly losing ground. I personally think the decision to keep this private was an act of enormous dignity. This was a man who built his identity on physical strength, a man whose entire public persona was about being tough and never showing weakness. Revealing a long-term cancer diagnosis while still working would have changed how people looked at him, possibly in ways he did not want. He was protecting something, the ability to just be himself in public for as long as he could. Norman Hunter was born on the 29th of October 1943 in Ayton Banks, County Durham. If you know anything about County Durham in that era, you know the landscape. Coal mines, tight communities, hard work passed down like a family heirloom. It was a place that did not produce soft people. His entry into the world carried loss from the very first moment. His father, Norman Sr., had died just 2 months before he was born. He never knew his dad. He was raised by his mother, Betty, supported by a close-knit extended family, including 2 football-playing uncles, Bill and Frank. The family followed Newcastle United with the kind of fierce and total devotion that only people from the northeast truly understand. Despite his obvious talent, both Newcastle and Sunderland overlooked him for trials. The boy grew up supporting Newcastle United. He trained hard. He had real ability, and neither of the local clubs wanted to look at him. That kind of rejection marks you. It hardens you. It gives you something to prove. He began an apprenticeship as an electrical fitter, steady work for the industrial north, but a Leeds United scout saw him playing for Birtley Juniors, and after a successful trial against Bradford Park Avenue Juniors, Hunter made the decision to leave the trade behind and join the ground staff at Elland Road. He was 15 years old. Young lads on the ground staff did not just train, they maintained the stadium. They were embedded in the place before they ever got near the first team. By the time Hunter became a Leeds United player, he was not a visitor. He was someone who had already spent years putting work into that ground with his own hands. That connection, born out of rejection and hard graft, and a long road from County Durham to West Yorkshire, was the foundation of everything that followed. When Don Revie became player-manager of Leeds United in 1961, the club was a second division outfit with limited ambition. Revie changed all of that. And for Norman Hunter, Revie became something that went beyond football management. He became the closest thing to a father figure that Hunter had ever known. That matters. Think about the picture. Hunter had grown up without a dad. He had been rejected by his local clubs. He had come to Leeds at 15, working his way towards something he had no guarantee of reaching. And then Revie arrived. Revie, who treated his players like family. Revie, who knew the names of their wives and children. Revie, who sent cards for birthdays. For a young man with a gap where a father should have been, that attention was powerful. Revie's methods were thorough and, in some cases, unusual. He looked at Hunter and saw a technically gifted youngster who was too slight for the top level. His solution was direct. Every day, Hunter was given a glass of Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry mixed with a raw egg, designed to help him put on weight. It frequently made him physically ill. I personally think that detail says more about the culture at that club than any trophy could. Here is a manager telling a teenage boy to drink something that makes him sick in the name of development. And the boy does it every single day. That combination of trust in the manager and personal desperation to succeed tells you exactly where Hunter's drive came from. The physical transformation worked. Hunter developed and became the defensive presence Revie had envisioned. He formed a partnership with Jack Charlton that became one of the most respected in English football history. Charlton provided the aerial dominance, tall and commanding in the box. Hunter was the reader of the game, the one who could anticipate where the ball was going before it arrived, intercept and distribute cleanly from the back. Together they covered each other's weaknesses in a way that made the whole unit function like a machine. The honours followed. Leeds won the second division title in 1963-64, the first division in 1968-69, and again in 1973-74, the FA Cup in 1972, the League Cup in 1968, 2 Intercities Fairs Cup wins in 1968 and 1971. Hunter made 726 appearances for the club over 15 years. But alongside the success came the reputation. The Dirty Leeds label was not invented in a vacuum. This was a side that played hard. They challenged, they fouled, they pushed against the edges of the rules. Hunter was at the centre of that style. He was the enforcer, the man you knew was coming for you if you tried anything clever near the Leeds penalty area. What bothers me about the Dirty Leeds narrative is that it was used to dismiss genuine quality. Leeds under Revie were technically superior to most of what England had at the time, but it was easier to call them dirty than to acknowledge they were also very, very good. The brutality became the story, and the quality was buried underneath it. The nickname did not come from a journalist trying to stir trouble. It came from the fans, his own fans. During the 1972 FA Cup final against Arsenal, a match Leeds won 1-0, somebody in the crowd unfurled a banner that read, "Norman bites your legs." 3 words and a name, simple and immediately brilliant. Brian Clough was working as a pundit for the BBC broadcast that day, spotted the banner and pointed it out to the nation. By the following morning, the phrase was everywhere and it never left. You can understand why it caught on. It had rhythm, it had menace. It painted a picture in your head without needing explanation. Nicknames like that are shorthand. They compress something complicated into something everyone can use. And for Norman Hunter, the compression cost him for the rest of his career. Here is what the nickname buried. Hunter was, by the assessment of his fellow professionals, a technically gifted footballer. His ability to read the game was exceptional. His passing from the back was clean and purposeful. He had a range and quality on the ball that most defenders of his era simply did not possess. None of that fits on a banner. None of it becomes a chant, so it was left off the story. The clearest evidence against the nickname's accuracy came in 1974. That year, professional footballers voted for the inaugural PFA Players' Player of the Year award. The first ever winner, they chose Norman Hunter. His fellow professionals, the people who played against him every week and knew exactly what he was capable of, chose him as the best player in the country. Think about that. Not the most fearsome, not the most intimidating, the best. That is not the profile of a brute with no skill. That is the profile of a footballer who had the deep respect of everyone in the game. But Hunter himself helped feed the label. He played to the crowd. He wore the Hardman identity as a badge. He described it in later years as panto, as performance. But by participating in the spectacle, by leaning into the menace, he made it harder for people to see past it. When you lean into a one-dimensional image for long enough, it becomes very difficult to argue later that the image was unfair. The nickname became a burden as much as a brand. It boxed him in. It made him the villain before anyone had even looked at what he actually achieved. And he had handed them the costume. Norman Hunter earned 28 caps for England between 1965 and 1974. For most players, that would be a career highlight worth celebrating. For Hunter, it was a source of quiet frustration as much as pride. Because for the majority of those years, he was the deputy, the man waiting behind Bobby Moore and Jack Charlton, the established defensive partnership that Alf Ramsey trusted above all others. Moore and Charlton were exceptional. Hunter was competing for a position occupied by two of the greatest defenders England has ever produced. That is bad luck more than poor management, but it meant his international career was defined by waiting rather than doing, by being good enough to be in the squad, but rarely given the stage to prove it. Then came 1966. England hosted the World Cup. England won the World Cup. And Norman Hunter was part of the 22-man squad. But because he did not play in the final against West Germany, FIFA regulations at the time meant he did not receive a winner's medal. The 11 men who finished the final got their medals. Hunter went home without one. That injustice stuck. The Football Association ran a long campaign to persuade FIFA to recognise all squad members. It took over 4 decades. In 2007, FIFA finally agreed. On the 10th of June 2009, Hunter was presented with his World Cup Winners' Medal by Prime Minister Gordon Brown at 10 Downing Street. He kissed it. The photographs from that day are extraordinary. A man in his 60s holding something he had earned in his 20s, receiving recognition that should have arrived 43 years earlier. The 17th of October 1973, England versus Poland in a World Cup qualifier. England needed a result. They dominated long stretches of the game, and then Norman Hunter, on the halfway line, lost possession to Polish winger Grzegorz Lato. That turnover led directly to the goal that knocked England out of contention for the 1974 World Cup. Let me be fair about the context. England should not have been in a position where one mistake decided the qualifier. The Polish goalkeeper produced one of the most remarkable individual performances in the history of the competition. England hit the woodwork, had shots cleared off the line, played with what felt like total control for long periods. But football is not about control. It is about the scoreline. And when Hunter gave the ball away to Lato, the Polish counter was devastating. It was the kind of mistake that defines careers. Not because it was unusual, ball loss on the halfway line happens to every player, but because of the stage, because of the consequence, because England did not go to West Germany for the 1974 World Cup, and one moment involving Norman Hunter became the shorthand explanation for why. He talked about it openly. He called it a sporting tragedy that he revisited frequently in his mind. When you contribute to something that significant, it does not leave you alone. You replay it. You wonder how many things might have been different. England missing the 1974 World Cup was not just a personal disappointment for the players involved, it was a national moment. The country had won in 1966. There was a genuine belief that England belonged at every major tournament. And then they were not there. Not because of a tactical failure over a campaign, but because of one moment. One ball lost on one evening in October. The weight placed on Hunter for that evening was enormous, and by any fair accounting, disproportionate. The 1st of November 1975, Leeds United versus Derby County at the baseball ground. First Division football. Norman Hunter and Franny Lee on the same pitch. Two of the most combative players in the country, with a history that had been simmering for years. Franny Lee was a brilliant footballer. Clever, quick, and very effective at winning penalties. That last point was where the tension with Hunter came from. In Hunter's view, Lee had a habit of going down in the penalty area when contact was made. Lee knew how to turn a physical challenge into a set-piece opportunity. For a defender built around the idea of winning the ball cleanly, that kind of play was deeply offensive. On that afternoon in Derby, it boiled over. The two men got into a violent altercation on the pitch. Referee Derek Nippard sent both of them off, but the fighting did not stop when the red cards came out. As they were being walked off the pitch, it continued. Hunter split Lee's lip with a left hook. The whole exchange was captured by television cameras and broadcast on Match of the Day for the entire country to see. Let us not dress this up. It was ugly. A public display of violent indiscipline. Two international footballers brawling their way off a football pitch while the cameras rolled. It became one of the most replayed clips from that era of English football, and it attached itself to Hunter's reputation like glue. In his autobiography Biting Talk, Hunter addressed the incident directly. He was not inclined to forgive and forget. He attributed the violence to a frustration with Lee's pattern of diving to win penalties, which he found professionally loathsome. He later admitted in public that he was not proud of the footage, which is the minimum you would expect, but he also maintained a retrospective dry wit about the era, as if the violence was simply a product of the time rather than a choice made by an individual. In 2006, novelist David Peace published The Damned United, a fictionalised account of Brian Clough's 44-day tenure at Leeds in 1974. The film adaptation followed in 2009. Between them, they introduced a new generation to the Revie-era Leeds squad in the worst possible way. Hunter was portrayed in the film as a dark, moody and threatening figure. In one scene that had no basis in real events, his character physically assaulted Clough during a training session. This was fiction. It did not happen. There is no credible account from anyone present that anything resembling that scene ever took place. But it was put on screen, with an actor playing Norman Hunter committing an act of violence against a manager. And it was presented within a dramatic framework that blurred the line between fact and invention. Joe Jordan, who was there and knew exactly what happened, categorically denied that any such incident occurred. He was direct about the inaccuracy and the damage it did to the reputations of men who were still alive. Hunter was deeply unhappy about the portrayal. This was not a minor creative exaggeration. This was a film that painted him as a violent figure willing to attack a manager, reaching audiences who had never seen him play and had no context for who he actually was. From 1993 until his death in 2020, he worked as a match summariser for BBC Radio Leeds and Yorkshire Radio. His voice became a constant and familiar presence for a generation of Leeds supporters who may never have seen him play but knew exactly who he was from the radio. Colleagues described him as charming, humble and almost self-effacing, a man about as far from the bite your legs image as you could possibly get. Go back to April 2020, the lockdown, the empty streets, the daily statistics on the evening news. The feeling that the rules of normal life had been suspended. That was the world Norman Hunter died in. The speed of his decline was brutal. Hospitalised on the 10th, described as severely unwell on the 16th, gone on the 17th. 1 week, 7 days from admission to confirmation of death. For the football world, following the updates in real time, that speed felt like an ambush. The CLL piece is essential to understanding what happened. COVID-19 did not take down a fully healthy 76-year-old man in the space of a week by chance. It found someone whose immune system had already been compromised by 7 years of living with a blood cancer. The virus had less to fight than it appeared to from the outside. The Hardman was not as physically fortified as the public assumed, and that assumption was based on an image built over decades, maintained even as the reality underneath it quietly changed. The lockdown made everything worse in practical terms. The isolation, the distance from family, the disruption to normal care and treatment, the enormous pressure on hospitals. Everything about the context of April 2020 amplified the vulnerability of someone in his position. He was not just a man with COVID, he was a man with a suppressed immune system in his late 70s, hospitalised during the most chaotic period the National Health Service had faced in modern history. His family could not be beside him in the way families normally are when someone they love is seriously ill. Updates came from medical staff rather than from the room itself. That kind of distance, in those specific circumstances, carries its own particular weight. There is a cruelty in the specifics of how this ended that goes beyond the illness itself. The brutal reputation could not protect him. No amount of toughness, no amount of the qualities celebrated and mythologized for so many decades could change the biology. And in that gap between the myth and the reality, between the Hardman legend and the fragile human being, the ending of his story became a tragedy in the most complete sense of the word. The harder the reputation, the harsher the reminder that strength is always temporary and the body will eventually take over from the image. His did in April 2020, while the country was locked down and the world had gone very quiet. Claire Hunter did not stay in the silence after her father died. She chose to take the truth about the CLL and turn it into something that could help other people. The family established the Norman Hunter Golf Day, an annual fundraising event that has brought together the football and business communities around a shared cause. The event has raised significant funds for the Leeds Cancer Centre and for research at the University of Leeds. These are not vanity donations. They are not plaques on walls. They are contributions to scientific work that is producing real results for people living with the same condition that weakened him. The most specific outcome of that fundraising is the purchase of a piece of medical equipment called a magnetic cell sorter. The purpose of this machine is straightforward. It allows scientists to identify mutated and treatment-resistant cells in CLL patients much earlier than was previously possible. Earlier identification means better treatment options. It means more time for patients and their families. It means fewer people in the position that his family found themselves in, dealing with a condition that had been progressing while the window for intervention was quietly shrinking. The Hardman image is being replaced, one fundraising event at a time, by something that matters far more, something real, something that will outlast any nickname or controversy or film portrayal. Shortly after his death, Leeds United announced that the South Stand at Elland Road would be renamed the Norman Hunter South Stand. His name is now physically part of the structure of the club he gave 15 years and 726 appearances to, every match day, every home game. Every time a supporter looks up at that stand, the name is there. That is the kind of honour that lasts. Not a book, not a film, not a nickname. A stand. Permanent, structural, part of the ground itself. The full picture of Norman Hunter is more complicated than any single version allows. He was a fierce competitor who crossed lines. He was also a skilled footballer whose technical ability was consistently underestimated by the people reducing him to a cartoon villain. He was the face of the dirty Leeds era and the human being behind it, who colleagues described as charming and self-effacing. He was the Hardman who spent 7 years quietly living with a blood cancer that nobody outside his family knew about. He was the voice of Leeds United on the radio for nearly 3 decades. He was a father whose daughter loved him enough to use his story to fight for other people. None of those things cancel each other out. They are all part of the same person. The real Norman Hunter is bigger and stranger and more interesting than the nickname ever suggested. And the quieter truths, the passing range, the inaugural PFA award, the radio voice, the 7 years of private illness, had to wait much longer to find their audience. They are finding it now. The legacy is the medical research being done in his name. The legacy is the stand at Elland Road. The legacy is what his daughter started when she chose to break her silence. And that is how the man who was called gutless ended up leaving something permanent and genuinely generous behind. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to Beyond Football, and tell us in the comments what you think his true legacy really is. Was he a misunderstood great, or did his own choices define him? We want to hear from you.